Hey, before I kick off the podcast, I just want to shout out Next Door Clothing. Next Door, a clothing brand based out of Bondi in Sydney. They're making really nice jeans and shirts and hats. So go and check out their full range at nextdoorsydney.com. They're also artists, so you can go and check out a range of art. They put on rad parties, and I love what they're doing. So nextdoorsydney.com for the full range.
This is for Clementine and Otis. All right, so a shout out to our sponsors, Indosol. They're the major sponsors of the THT podcast. They're a B Corp certified company. They just make rad footwear, recycled motor vehicle tires. If you're in a country that's going into summer right now, and even if you're not, get into a summer state of mind and get a pair of Indosols at www.indosol.com and use code THT at checkout for a 15% discount. They've got distributors in Europe, USA, Australia, Indonesia, Japan, the Middle East, Singapore, and Taiwan. So they'll get your shoes to you fast wherever you are.
I'm having a good time.
You are?
Yeah.
I can tell.
And we are rolling too.
Terrible Happy Talks. Terrible Happy Talks. Terrible Happy Talks. Terrible Happy Talks. Today's guest is Matt Leggett. Matt is a husband, father, anthropologist, and associate director at Wildlife Conservation Society. Matt is a true eco-warrior with many years of experience in remote expeditions, field conservation, and community engagement programs across Asia Pacific and Latin America, not to mention extensive experience working on environmental policy and strategy, supporting developing country governments and NGOs. Today, Matt is with me live from the highlands of Scotland to share his journey, experiences, challenges, and hopes for the future. Matt Leggett, welcome.
Thanks, man. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Mate, thanks for being here, and I'm stoked. And we were just talking about the weather, and he said that it was minus 27 degrees the other day in Scotland, and I just can't fathom it.
I think, we know each other from Indonesia, right? I think it's a 50-degree temperature shift or something crazy. So it's been a cold winter, but it's been an experience. First winter for almost a decade for me.
So why have you had to transition from Indonesia to Scotland? You said you're in Indonesia for what, 7 or 8 years? Yeah,
so 7 or 8 years in Indonesia. We kind of got caught up in a lot of complexity around COVID, the sort of combination of visa difficulties and Indonesia, our visas running out, came just at the same time that airports around the world started to be closed. So we had to make a snap decision to leave, and left behind dogs and cats and food and clothes, and landed in the UK and essentially had to put a finger on the map. And we were like, well, where do you go in a pandemic? You go somewhere quiet and far away from people, and somewhere we can, get back out into the wilderness. And this is where we are. So we ended up here, and we're still here.
I mean, is that how you make a lot of your decisions in regards to where you live, that you're in the wilderness?
That's a great question. I've lived in some cities in my life. I think I lasted a year in London. I lasted a year and a half in Jakarta. Cities and I don't get on super well. Like, I love visiting them, but living them it's not good for my mental health at all. I spend a lot of time looking lost and confused and generally pretty miserable. So the quicker I can get out to somewhere that's a little bit more rural, it's better for everyone, really.
Yeah. You, man, your resume is amazing. Like, it's so interesting. And can you just sort of let me know, or tell us, how did you get into this originally? Writing policy on environment, the Wildlife Conservation Society. How did the journey start?
Well, the journey really began. So I actually grew up in Papua New Guinea. So I'm sort of a slight oddity in that I spent a lot of my childhood overseas, but in places that were pretty interesting. And so grew up in New Guinea. And at the time, you're a kid, you don't think these things have much of an impact. Things don't sink in, right? And then came back to the UK when I was about 10. And then, after a while, I just started thinking, I had this kind of calling to get back to the tropics. And I remember flicking through university prospectuses when I was, whatever it is, 17, 18. And literally I got to A, and A was for anthropology. And the lead page was all about peoples and cultures in like interesting parts of the world. And I was like, well, that's me. I don't need to go any further than A. So I signed on for that. Very quickly realized that it was pretty fascinating stuff. And then as soon as I could, I think 6 months into my undergrad degree, started traveling on the back of anthropology. And I was really into expeditions at the time. I was a big climber and mountaineer. I'd spent a lot of time doing bits and pieces in my early teens and become quite good. So I ended up essentially coming up with excuses to go back to interesting places. So went back to New Guinea pretty quickly, set up some expeditions there, went to Latin America, spent a lot of time in the Amazon, tracking orangutans to the jungle in Malaysia. And this was all kind of before I finished my degree, and then finished that degree and was like, well, here we go. This is me. So I went into doing a lot of expeditions, which brought in kind of the anthropology as well quite early on. So that was kind of the beginning of everything.
Wow, man. So interesting. Like, how has it evolved since you've had a family? Are you behind a desk more often than you ever have been?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Absolutely. It's the curse of seniority is right. You get all this experience, you do all these great things, right? And life tries to pull you further and further away from the things that you love. So yeah, I'm definitely behind a desk a lot. I mean, I think one of the things that changes is that I have to do things faster. So, like whereas before I would have spent a week going and doing a trip, I'm finding myself like not sleeping and eating in order to cram in a week's trip into sort of 4 days, so I'm back in time to take the kids to school on a Monday or whatever it is. And I've been lucky, I spent most of my professional working life overseas, and that has made adventures and expeditions and getting out into rural communities a lot easier than it is for, someone who lives in London or something like that.
Okay, so when you're going out into these if we go back to those earlier days and getting out in the field, when you're going into rural communities, like what is generally your primary objective?
So initially, like way back in the early days, it was a combination. It was a combination of science and pure expedition fun. And like if you were going to kind of call it anything, it's just kind of an adventure. So I was involved a lot in the establishment of some national parks in South America. So where I take a group of scientists and we go into a remote part of the rainforest and we do an assessment of what was there, so the biodiversity and the ecology of the area. And we come back, we write a report, and on the back of that report, a national park might be gazetted, might be established. So that was kind of one example. And then, like more latterly, I got into doing the same kind of thing for TV companies. So I was working with Nat Geo and the BBC and other companies to basically do filming trips of the same kind of intent, really. So it kind of evolved. And then I think after a number of years, I just felt that as great as these trips were, and they really were great, I wanted to stick around. Like I wanted to be there a bit more, I wanted to see how I could kind of contribute. And that's what led me into what I'm doing now, which is kind of more longer term, complex projects trying to deal with environment and social issues in some of these really forest frontier areas, really.
Well, yeah, that was like my next question in terms of like, what does a day in the life look like for you at more of a senior level? Is it like, planning and strategizing? Is it, discussing policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty varied, to be honest. So a lot of the stuff that I'm doing at the moment is really around trying to essentially invent new ways of trying to keep forests standing. And that's a pretty wild and kind of rocky area of work, right? So it spans everything from kind of speaking to communities on the front line, literally like what is going on in these villages, what are the drivers of change around forests and ecology? Why are people cutting down the forests? Mostly it's because they're poor and they need the money, so really trying to understand the nuts and bolts of that, but then taking that knowledge and taking that information and then going to talk to the World Bank, going to talk to the UN, going to talk to policymakers in the US government to try and get them to direct solutions that I know will solve these problems on the ground in an effective way. So it's kind of bringing together both ends of the spectrum, everything from high level conversations with directors of banks and the NGOs and the UNs, all the way down to talking to farmers in the village.
I mean, but fundamentally, does it come down to supporting local farmers and putting food on the table for these communities?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, what are we looking at now? It's around 75% of most of the impacts on forests now come from agriculture, come from our food. And that's food that we have, we all have in our lives every day, whether it's coffee or palm oil or cocoa in our chocolate, it's everywhere. And that all essentially, most of the commodities in the world now are grown by smallholder farmers. So, some guy in Guatemala who needs a little bit of extra land is going to be cutting down that forest in order to grow a little bit more to sell to the company that's making your chocolate or your cocoa or your coffee or whatever. So, yeah. So essentially a lot of it is an economic market failure at the forest frontier, really.
I mean, have you seen like the agricultural industry just taking, advantage of local farmers and communities?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I would say with all industries, there are companies who definitely aggressively take advantage. I would say the majority of companies have probably mostly just failed to ask the questions they should have asked. It's not malicious. There's no malice intended. There's no kind of desire to cause harm. But perhaps, where they were buying coffee from a farm, they wouldn't previously have asked, hey, like, did you cut down any forests recently to grow this coffee? And the difference, I guess, between now and the conversation I was having 10 years ago with some of these guys is that those questions are being asked. And that's largely because of people like you and me, right? Going out to the shops and asking the questions of the products we buy, so that it does have an impact.
So the consumer controls it really, don't they? Consumer culture.
Yeah. I mean, consumers have an enormous amount of power. Like if everyone stopped buying McDonald's tomorrow, McDonald's will go bust in a week.
Let's do it. Okay, everyone stop buying McDonald's tomorrow.
Right. Like if you go to Walmart and everybody goes to Walmart and they buy one type of fish, like the Marine Stewardship Council type fish, versus the fish that's been caught by a trawler in the Japanese Sea, those businesses go dead pretty quick. Like it's a matter of weeks and months. And so I think we often underestimate the power that consumers have, for sure. And that's kind of scary, but it's also pretty exciting, right?
It is. Sort of now that you've had sort of, years of experience with this stuff and you've dealt with governments at the policy writing level, how would you describe the scale of bureaucracy that you might come across? Have you had any experience with it? And you must see it quite often. The red tape that you have to go through to make change. Like, does it feel impossible to get anything done sometimes in regards to these issues?
Yeah, it does. It does sometimes feel impossible, and it's one of the reasons why conservation and the environment sector is full of cynical optimists, right?
Are you a cynical optimist?
Oh, I'm absolutely a cynical optimist. I always go into it with like my heart full of hope, but with an edge of cynicism that things are going to go wrong at some point. I can't quite tell when. Yeah, I mean, the red tape is amazing, and that is one of the reasons why projects often fail, sadly. And I think often the expectations are also really, really unrealistic. So, a donor, so say a big government, often a Western government, might come in and say, right, we want you to solve poverty in this area, and we want you to fix like deforestation, and we want you to kind of come up with a better water supply, and we want you to do all these things. But you've only got 18 months to do it in, and we need you to report on your financial expenditure every 6 weeks. So you're so busy reporting on the data and kind of keeping the donor happy that you never have time to do the work. And who fixes anything in 18 months, right? Nothing gets done in 18 months, So there's some unrealistic expectations which sometimes kill you before you start, and that can be quite frustrating sometimes.
Well, what keeps you going personally? Like, why don't you get jaded?
For me, I think one of the things that's really important is maintaining perspective. I mean, I mentioned earlier, the difference between now and a decade ago in the conversations that I'm having. I've seen real fundamental change in the way that people are having conversations about the environment. 10 years ago, if you were interested in the environment, you were kind of slightly out there, and now we're having banks and major supermarkets talking about, nature-based solutions. They're talking about natural capital. How do you kind of account in your balance sheet for the nature services that you're using? They're talking about carbon. They're talking about consumers caring about, where products come from. So there's some fairly significantly positive shifts. And I think sometimes when you're in the detail, you can feel a bit hopeless because you don't see this kind of bigger incremental move, right? But if you stop and zoom out, and I often have to stop and zoom out on a Friday, and Friday night is right now, right? So Friday night is my stop and zoom out time where I try and kind of take account of what's actually gone right in the week. And often the progress is largely positive. Yes, there's steps back, and but yeah, I think we're going in the right direction. The question is, how do we accelerate it? And that's something that keeps me up at night, really.
How do we accelerate it? Yeah, I love that. Hey, can you tell us that story about the World Heritage Site in Indonesia that you saved from deforestation, the UNESCO World Heritage Site? And from what I hear, it was quite an amazing achievement. And you were, I guess, battling coffee companies or coffee farmers or industry. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So, this is an interesting case point, really. So, I joined I moved to Indonesia, as I say, about 7 years ago. And when I arrived, I was, as you do when you're a new employee, you get shown all this information, right? You sit down and people show you presentations about the work that's going on in the country. And I was shown this series of presentations about this national park in the bottom left-hand corner of Sumatra called the Bukit Barisan Selatan National Park. So it's trips off the tongue. It's about 350,000 hectares of rainforest. It's got a really important Sumatran tiger population. So lots of really interesting biodiversity. It was one of Indonesia's flagship national parks. Really, really interesting. So they're showing me all these presentations and these slides. And they were talking about tiger density. So, when you're a scientist, you're trying to understand what's going on with tigers. You go out and you put those camera traps, these automatic cameras in the forest, and you take pictures of tigers. And what they were basically saying was, "Oh, isn't it great? We've seen more and more tigers on these camera traps, and we're getting fantastic results for tigers." But in the background of these slides, what I could see was that the forest area was getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller year on year. So, being the new guy, I put my hand up and said, "Hold on. So are you not just getting more photos of tigers because there's less and less forest for the tigers to be in?" Which was met by fairly stony silence, I would say. And so that kind of started me out on this journey of going, okay, what's going on in this area with relation to deforestation? And what we essentially found out was coffee companies, a lot of major coffee companies, the Nestle's and the Olams and the big coffee buyers, had been buying coffee from this area for 20, 25 years. And year on year, the national park was getting smaller by 1 or 2%. And that doesn't sound much, but that basically, that's 100 years. You've got 100 years until that park's completely gone. So I basically set about proving that these coffee companies were in danger of buying coffee that was causing deforestation. And I did that by hiring a whole team of people on motorbikes who followed coffee trucks in and out of the national park for 6 months.
Nice. Guerrilla
tactics.
warfare.
Right. So
no,
we got all that information together, and we
they were stalking them on motorbikes.
Yeah, right.
Just like analyzing what they were doing.
Yeah, so I had them taking pictures of number plates and stalking the motorbikes and using GPS to map the routes they were taking, and then going to warehouses where they were being dropped. The coffee was being dropped off in the village, and then following them again, and people kind of basically undercover informant work. And we basically proved that all these companies were buying this coffee and it was grown illegally. And so I took that information and I flew to Europe and I went to all the big coffee house headquarters in Geneva and Hamburg and said, look, I've got all this information. I've got two things I can do with it. I can either go to Greenpeace and we can cause a hell of a stink, or we can come up with a better plan. And so on the back of this approach, we got around about 16 different companies to agree to a set of principles to stop buying coffee that was illegally grown inside the national park. And
so, sorry, just to go back, Matt, who were you saying that to at those conferences? Were you saying it to governments, or were you saying it to the heads of the companies?
No, the heads of the companies. So the kind of the head coffee buyer for Nestle and the head coffee buyer.
They would have shit themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough. I mean, imagine being that guy, right? Imagine being the head coffee buyer for one of these companies, or
because they're huge companies.
Huge companies, and you just think if someone like me walks through the door with all this information, you just think, oh God, here we go. So I mean, I put them in a position which was pretty difficult because there was no real argument or way for them to say that this wasn't happening because I had everything, laid out. And yeah, so they kind of had to get involved. And so that was the beginning of that. So it became a big project.
So you effectively, for lack of a better word, you effectively like blackmailed them?
I guess that would be one way you could describe it.
That's a bad word. I can't think of another word. You were kind of just like, hey, busted, like you're caught red-handed. What are you going to do about it?
I mean, it was kind of interesting because, actually the response of a couple of these companies, to give them credit, was they were super grateful because they had no way of getting this information themselves.
Right.
The way that their companies are established, you send a guy to the field and you say, go and buy coffee. They've got very few resources and they don't look into detail and what's going on in the supply chains. So a lot of these companies are actually pretty grateful. They were like, oh, this is amazing. Thanks so much. We never knew that this was a risk. This is brilliant. How can we help? So actually they were very positive.
But is that a bit of a cop-out though? They've got financial resources. Like, do you think it's just a bit like they could have actually done the investigating themselves to really find out where their coffee was coming from? Like, we're talking Nestle.
Right.
The same people that sell us Nescafe Blend 43. Instant coffee. We're talking about those guys.
Right. I mean,
yeah, and they were selling, and we're basically people are drinking coffee that was bought illegally.
I mean, there's always two ways of looking at it. I mean, yes, on one hand, I completely agree with you. Like, these companies have got a huge amount of money. They've got a lot of power, a lot of control. But it kind of goes back to what we were saying before. People are really just starting to look at this for the first time in some cases. This is a relatively new problem for a lot of companies. And and for a lot of companies, when you've got Greenpeace banging on your door, you deal with the Greenpeace banging on the door first, right? And typically most NGOs these days are banging on the door about palm oil. So most companies are thinking, we got to be really careful. What are we doing about palm oil? What's our policy? What's our label? What does it say on our label? Like, we've got to be ready on palm oil. And there's this kind of other group of things which, I kind of call second tier commodities, which are incredibly important in the context of deforestation, the environment, but haven't really received the same level of scrutiny. So for some of these companies, they just don't, their sourcing operations are so vast. And they've not built into the system somebody whose job it is to go and ask these questions. And that's changing too. So I think that's a positive change. But yeah, I agree with you. You're right. This is the kind of thing you shouldn't need somebody banging on the door to make you stand up and do it first, right?
Yeah, and I understand too where you're coming from. I guess these companies that get so big and so complex, and in a way, they've probably lost their way sometimes. And they're like you said, they were probably grateful that you've sort of raised that awareness. Are they really that scared of Greenpeace?
So, the short answer is yes. And I'll tell you why.
Yes.
It's because
Why?
if you look back at kind of the effectiveness of campaigns, Greenpeace campaigns, or campaigns from other campaigning NGOs, they have been, because they ultimately target consumers, they can be enormously damaging to shareholder value, and they can be damaging overnight. So, I don't know I don't know quite whether the same campaigns have reached Australia, but like there was like a Kit Kat campaign, which was an orangutan finger. I don't know if you saw that one. Right, it was
an orangutan finger.
Right, so there was palm oil from rainforest, and I'm trying to remember who did it. I think it was probably Greenpeace or Rainforest Action Network, and they had the sound of the Kit Kat snapping, the Kit Kat fingers snapping. They just spliced it onto an image of an orangutan in the forest being shot, basically, and it was it's an amazing campaign. But I mean, it's just there was one in the US with Barbie and Ken. And they had all the packaging was made from pulp that came out of rainforests, and they targeted Mattel, who made Barbie, and they had like Barbie and Ken basically chopping down rainforests. Some of these campaigns are genius, and they killed these companies. Like people stopped buying Barbie and Ken, people stopped buying Kit Kats, and they do it overnight, and they can be enormously impactful. So, I love the campaigns that these guys do. I think they have a real place, and they can be really, really effective. But I think it's also important to have those other groups who are prepared to go in and be really pragmatic about how you get things done. So it's a good balance. I've got a lot of respect for them.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we need our Greenpeace organisations, and we need Sea Shepherd. I guess, who would you say are a little bit more militant?
Yeah, Sea Shepherd are pretty militant, right? I think they're super important. I think these companies need to be held to account sometimes as well, and they can have a real impact. So yeah, I would never say that. I would never be against them.
So you see yourself in that space in between where you actually want to, work with them, not against them. Let's move forward. How can we start to rebuild and regroup?
Yeah, once the campaign is done, you've got to have some plan after that. You've got to have a sort of sensible plan about how to move forward. So I'm on board with that. Like if you're going to have a campaign against palm oil in rainforests, brilliant. Okay, once that campaign's over and the dust has settled, how do we actually move forward and make sure this is going to happen? In reality, how do we deal with the complexity on the ground of making that happen?
When you first brought that information to these companies, was there any occasions where you've had a tap on the shoulder and maybe like a bribe or a financial sort of incentive to disappear?
Interestingly enough,
come on.
No, I mean, I've never had anything from a company to kind of make me gently go away. I've definitely had some interesting conversations in corridors with governments, where governments have wanted conversations to go away. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, interesting. Is there a safety aspect that you need to consider? Like, have you ever felt like, hang on, am I stirring the pot too much here? Am I going to piss someone off? And yeah.
I mean, for sure. I think that's always, more than once. I've definitely had that. I mean, I know that in many of the countries that I've worked, many of the countries, probably an exaggeration, in more than one or two of the countries that I've worked, I know that there are Secret Service files on stuff that I've written because I've seen them. People have thrown them at me and said, right, or like waved them at me and said, hey, this file's got we know everything about you. You've got to watch out. So yeah, that's happened in a couple of places for sure.
Interesting. Yeah.
Which I always think is quite funny. Right, I think it's quite funny because I'm not really a campaigner, right? I'm not, that's not really my skill set. So in a way, I kind of take that as a bit of a badge of honor. It sort of makes me feel like at least I'm pushing the right buttons.
Yes. Do you feel that you're living with purpose in your job? Like, is it still there?
Yeah, it is. It occasionally needs a reboost. I mean, sometimes, when you get sucked into the policy stuff and you're having days of meetings talking about complex financial arrangements for a project or something. Sometimes you sort of forget what it's all about. So occasionally I need a reboost, and often that's travel out to a project and spending time with some local colleagues, and so that's an important thing. If you don't do that, I think it could be really hard. But yeah, the purpose is still there for sure. And I take heart in the fact that things are moving in the right direction. I think if I'd have been sitting here having this conversation and, I still feel like I'm this crazy outsider who's got nice ideas, but nothing's ever changed, I think I'd find that really difficult. But things have moved well, I think, in the last couple of years.
Nice, man. Yeah, it's just it's so interesting to me to hear this stuff, and I just think that what you're doing is amazing. With a young family, I just sort of want to go into a little bit of your personal life. Like with the young family, they've traveled around with you a lot. How has that looked like logistically? Like, how have you managed? Because I do know that, and I've met your wife and I've spoke to her before on numerous occasions at the Green School, and she was telling me about just before you moved to Bali and went and sort of put your was it your son into Green School?
Your daughter, yeah.
Daughter, excuse me. You were living in a jungle in like remote Indonesia, in a village. How has that affected? Like, well, I guess I'm not really going too well with this question. I mean, how have you managed as a family with this lifestyle?
I think I don't know. I think we've managed pretty well. I think the thing that's the most challenging aspect of it in Indonesia was that the family were in one place, so they were pretty set. But as you know, and as people who know Indonesia know, if you're in the middle of Indonesia, you can have a 5-hour flight one direction to get to the top part of Indonesia, and a 5-hour flight the other direction to get to the bottom part of Indonesia. So it's an enormous country. So I was spending a lot of time traveling. I was traveling every 8 to 9 days. I was off on a trip. So it was a constant rolling flights. I was doing maybe 150 flights a year, and it
wow.
Quite aside from the carbon budget of that and the guilt factor of needing my own rainforest to offset the flights I was taking, it that has a toll for sure, and that can be really stressful. So yeah, and COVID is an incredible thing. This is the first time I've not been on a plane for this long since I was 16, probably, I think.
No way, dude. Wow. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I mean, my feet are beyond itchy, but
I think everyone.
But yeah, no, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. I think it's nice to have that reset. And I certainly, yeah. I mean, I couldn't. I think that to do this job from where I am right now would be quite hard. Like in the long term. I want to be connected to the people that I'm working with. I want to understand the local politics. I want to understand the issues that I'm surrounded by. I want to eat the food, smell the coffee, sweat the sweat, get into the forest, get these things done. And if I'm not able to do that, I think it becomes quite abstract. So I think, luckily for me, my wife is, we met on an expedition in Central America. She was an expedition nurse. She's got a back. She's incredibly competent in global travel, and thankfully so are our kids. They've been brought up on planes, trains, and automobiles. So that we're very lucky. Yeah, it's certainly lucky.
So cool. Yeah, it's so cool. I mean, what a foundation you've set for your children, and I think it's inspiring. That you've brought them along for the journey. I think it's super cool, man. You, I guess last time we connected, we were in Bali, and I said, like, I was working at the Green School, and yeah. How did you feel about that experience in Bali? Like after all the other traveling and living around the world that you've done, how would you rate Bali compared to that? Because Bali's a little bit different, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we used to joke. We used to joke and say that we peaked too early. Um, so, you know, it was the kind of place I thought I'd be in my sort of late 50s and 60s, not kind of in the kind of prime middle bit of my career. So, I mean, Bali is wonderful. It's very easy. You know, there's not many places in the world where you can go out and buy vegan Mexican food if you want it, right? Like it's, you know, and still be in a developing country. It's a very rare combination. So fantastic place, and brilliant, you know, for the kids particularly. But yeah, I'm certainly ready. I've still got a few more adventures in me. Some, you know, when I look at colleagues of mine who've, you know, have literally been in the middle of the rainforest for 10 years, I'd still have a kind of burning jealousy, which I'm learning to cope with. So yeah, hopefully we'll get a few more expeditions in at some point.
That's so cool. So like you're originally from the UK. So where did you grow up exactly?
Yeah, so I was actually born in the United Arab Emirates.
Interesting.
And then travelled around a bit with my parents when I was tiny, and ended up in New Guinea, and then was in New Guinea until I was around about 10. And then, yeah, I spent a sort of reluctant 8 years in the UK until I could get on a plane again by myself. And then I left again when I was 17 and a half, I think.
How did you end up in New Guinea?
So my parents were interesting. You hear this thing about New Guinea. You've probably heard this being an Australian, but mercenaries, misfits, or missionaries that you get in New Guinea. But they weren't any of those things. My dad's a water engineer. He was helping set up water supply in some of the rural parts of New Guinea. So yeah, that's where we were. And I had some good stories of being dragged along to kind of tribal fights in the highlands and festivals and all sorts of cool stuff. It was great.
Yeah, is that where you did? Like, how did you do your schooling?
Yeah, same kind of thing. So just Australian school in Port Moresby. Yeah, so pretty average, pretty run of the mill, really, for the time.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, how would you describe your school years? Like, was it something you enjoyed or you took to quite well?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it was good fun. I mean, you know, I think it was probably a precursor to the kind of green school ethos. Everything was outside. You know, we spent a lot of time playing on the beach and getting out into the forest and doing some good things. I have good memories. I don't remember learning a great deal, but I remember it being quite fun. Yeah, it was all good stuff.
Yeah. And what about high school years? Like, where did you do your high school years?
Oh, that was all the UK. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, you know, one of the challenges of growing up overseas, I think, is you never quite feel like you fit, right? And certainly turning up from New Guinea when I was 10 with an Australian accent and white blonde hair, you know, having lived in Papua New Guinea sort of makes you stand out somewhat when you go to, you know, your average UK-based comprehensive school. So yeah, that was all fine. I mean, really, it was kind of, I was plotting. I spent my high school years really just plotting an escape, and and made it pretty quickly.
Yeah, like, was there I mean, high school is a challenging time for a lot of people, young people, but was there a particular direction you wanted to go in high school? Like, did you know that you wanted to go down an academic path straight away?
I didn't actually. I definitely didn't think of myself as an academic. I was always my sister. And I think I came to the kind of academic side of things pretty late, I think. And it only really started clicking with the realization that you could actually study some stuff that was pretty interesting. You know, the classic school that I went to is like, if you weren't into reading Shakespeare and you weren't that hot at maths and you didn't, you know, you weren't that super interested in history, then there wasn't really a space for you. It wasn't really a box for you to sit in. And so I think when I realized that I could spend my days looking at how people took drugs in the Brazilian Amazon and why it was good for spirit quests, and I was going to get a degree for it. You know, that was a pretty kind of eye-opening experience for me. I was like, this is someone's going to applaud me for spending my time looking at this stuff. This is great.
You know, I'm going to go down that rabbit hole. Did you do that?
I had one experience, which was.
But wait up. Let's back it up. Why were you curious about that in the first place? Was that something you really wanted to find out?
I just think, you know, so I'm currently in the early stages of writing a book, which essentially is around. It's around kind of society, the connections between society, nature, and environmental degradation, right? And so I was just super interested in how cultures and societies in other parts of the world were faced with the same set of problems that we're faced everywhere. How to organize yourselves, like what religion to believe in, how to kind of manage conflict, what to do about childbirth, what to do about raising children, how to educate your children. All these kind of challenges are identical. And they came up with radically different solutions to those challenges in different parts of the world. And I just found that incredibly interesting, incredibly appealing. So, so for me, that was the nub of it. The fact that you could go somewhere and you realize that all the stuff you've been taught and all the stuff you've learned in your own culture and society is completely relative and is not fixed on any fundamental truth. As a kind of a poem writing, sort of dreamy 17, 18-year-old, I just found this to be incredibly alluring, really. So yeah, that was a big eye-opening experience. So yeah, that was what kicked it off.
Like working with some of these remote communities, like how predominant are their how predominant is their sense of spirituality and their spiritual practices in regards to how they structure their community?
I would say, it's important not to romanticize the communities that exist in some of these locations, but I would say, essentially one of the things that we have lost as a sort of more homogenous Western society is a connection to kind of between spirituality and nature. And I think that people in some of these areas, fundamentally their life experience and their attitudes and their beliefs are connected holistically to the world around them. And it's so evident that it's the first thing you notice and it's the first thing you miss, when you go into a community like this. And I find that to be deeply sad about the world we live in now. It's very different, right? So, yeah.
So going back to Brazil, in the remote communities of the Amazon, was there what was the original thing you wanted to find out about their was it ceremony and psychedelics, or spiritual ceremonies?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So I actually,
did you see a lot of that?
Yeah, I did actually. All over the world, in different ways and forms. But like I say, it's such a sort of normal part of everyday life. It's not it wasn't sort of a big deal really to be kind of around when some important event was happening. And they weren't, highlighted and flagged like these huge things that everyone, it just became part of normal existence. It's obviously something just was, okay, well, we're going to go hunting. We need to do this, and this in order to kind of, have a conversation with the spirits of this particular animal we're going to go and find. And then, that's going to make sure that we only take one and we don't kill five of them. And, that's going to keep us in balance. And, all of these conversations were sort of embedded within the, just being in these communities. So, yeah, I went to a very remote area in northern Brazil, southern Venezuela, where this community were living in what you might call a shabono, which is like a circular communal. A whole village live in a single building, basically. It's in a circle, and there's a hole in the roof, and it's like an upside down bowl with a hole in it. And to get in for sort of security and defense, to get in, you have to crawl through one opening, and you're on your stomach, right? So you crawl in through this thing, and as you start to see light, and you're coming through this sort of really thick thatch. As you come up, we were met by 5 or 6 guys with 7-foot long arrows pointed right at our eyeballs. Because obviously they didn't know who we were. We had actually been kind of tacitly invited, but they didn't know who we were, they didn't know whether we were safe, and what we, so that was quite an interesting experience. And then the same day they were heading out on a hunting trip that night, and they have this thing called yopo, which is a mixture of different herbs, which is hallucinogen, and they actually have a blowpipe with a two nozzles on the end of it, and each nozzle goes up each nostril, and they fire this stuff down this blowpipe, essentially into the soft tissues at the back of your brain. And that was pretty much the last thing I remember for quite a while. So it's quite an incredible experience. It helps. It's one of the amazing things that it helped you. I can see why it was amazing for hunting, because you could literally see leaves falling in the forest. The color, the greens were all completely distinct. You could, your senses were super vigilant and hyper aware. So it was an amazing experience. I was sick as a dog for about 3 or 4 days. So I wouldn't repeat it, but it was an interesting kind of hunting ritual moment for me, for sure.
So they would hunt under the influence of that.
Completely off the tree, yeah. Like it was amazing. So and these guys could put a blowpipe dart through a leaf at 250 paces. They were insanely efficient hunters. So yeah, it was pretty wild.
I just find it interesting in terms of like using these plant medicines to connect with nature and spirituality, and they've been ingrained in their cultures for what, hundreds of years,
thousands, yeah,
thousands, yeah. So you went to university straight from high school?
I took a year away, so I did the kind of UK gap year thing, which I don't even know if people do anymore. But so I went climbing and traveling for a year before I went to university. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. And you studied anthropology originally? Was that the first degree you did?
That was the first degree. Yeah, that was 3 years, and then I had a break of about 8 years, and then went back and did another degree.
All right. I mean, and how would you describe your university experience? I mean, was it a profoundly inspiring time in your life, or was it just something you just wanted to get out of the way so you could start your career or your passion?
I definitely think there was a little bit of this desire to get it done quickly. I kind of felt like I was missing out on the world a little bit. But I mean, it was an amazing experience. It's a great way of meeting people. I'm still good friends with all the people I met, pretty much, and we have regular catch-ups even now. So no, great experience for many reasons. I'm glad it was only 3 years. I think you look at people who do these sort of 5-6 year long degrees. I can't imagine. I was too impatient. I just wanted to get on with it.
Let's get on with it. Yeah.
To get on with it. And I don't know about you, but I sort of felt like even then, and this was a while ago now, 20 years ago, I got the sense that even then, like the value of the degree was shifting. Like this idea that I knew I wasn't going to come out of university and get a job as a result of my degree. I was going to come out of university and get a job as a result of my skills. And all the skills that got me the job were essentially my love and passion for indigenous communities and my expedition skills, like my outdoor skills. I walked straight into a job about 6 weeks after I left university on the basis of that. Like it wasn't my degree at all.
They probably didn't even look at that aspect of you.
No, and I don't think anyone has since, to be honest. And I think when I did my second degree, when I did my master's degree, I knew I was doing it in order to satisfy that line on the job application which says must have an advanced degree in. I wasn't doing it because I was like, I desperately need to, know more about this particular topic. And if I don't, even then I knew I could do the learning myself pretty quickly, but it was just getting that box ticked.
But do you think it might have developed those softer skills of, how to communicate professionally, how to research more thoroughly? Did it improve your academic writing? So do you think you got those things out of it, those transferable skills?
I would love to argue with you and say no, but I probably did.
Argue.
No, I probably. I definitely vividly remember with my master's degree thinking, I learned more in 6 months on an expedition living with a rural community in some of these interesting places than I did on this degree.
Yeah.
But yes, for sure. I mean, I definitely would have picked up some skills that I'm not giving credit to. But yeah, like could I have done it without a degree? Could I be doing my job now without a degree? The answer is absolutely yes.
Yeah, I think we've definitely gone through an educational paradigm shift in regards to tertiary education. I think it's becoming less relevant. I see it even as a high school teacher, and I also see universities adapting to that, and they're realizing that, and they're actually making it like access to universities more accessible to a broader range of people, and changing what it means to have a university degree. But I think it's really important for young people to acknowledge that their career success is not dependent on this piece of paper, that it can be, that there's variety of avenues. And I mean, and you just said it the best. I mean, you honed skills based on a passion, and that's what led you to the place you're in now. So I think it's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually good to hear you say that, because I've been out of that conversation for a while, and as my girls get older, we start to have these conversations about education more and more. And I was lucky in that, in my schooling, I reckon that you probably could have put me anywhere and I probably would have been all right. I was never going to be the stellar pupil. I was never going to be the complete dropout, but I was probably going to kind of figure it out, most of the time in most places. And then, and I had enough of the passion left after finishing school that I could kind of carry on, right? But I've had friends, and I'm sure you've had friends, who, like, the passion was completely knocked out of them at school. Like, school actually damaged them to the point that, it gave them issues for the rest of their lives, right?
Totally, man.
That upsets me a lot. And then to think that people are putting this pressure on themselves, or putting pressure on their kids at 17, 18, 19 to make decisions which really, affect their lives and can be quite negative. That upsets me a lot.
Like the self-esteem gets knocked out of them, but also their sense of identity. Like, they're kind of put in a position where they've got to conform to meet a criteria to get them into this other institution, and in the process, like I said, their identity and who they are as an individual seems to get washed away, or eroded, and it's really sad. Like, I mean, is that what attracted you and your family to the Green School? Is that what was something that was a driving force, that you wanted more of an alternative approach?
So interestingly enough, like, we ended up at Green School Bali by accident, because we were living in Jakarta. We hated it. We needed to get out, and we ended up being like, let's make a snap decision. Like, let's try living in Bali and see what happens. And then when we got there, we heard of this school, right? Everyone was like, "Oh, well, you work in the environment, so you must be going to Green School." And I'd be like, "What is this thing, Green School? What is this? I've never heard of this before." So we went along, and we kind of wanted to hate it. We sort of went along. We were like, "Oh God, there's going to be these kind of super holier than thou, like, environmental advocates, wearing sandals and kind of chanting. It's going to be rubbish." And then, really annoyingly, we actually really liked it.
You liked it?
We liked it. And we looked at each other afterwards. We were like, "Oh, man, that was really good, wasn't it?" We're like, "Oh, damn, it was really good."
Yeah.
And then, our kids were tiny. So they went in right at the bottom. We had kids going in at nursery level, and they were there for 5.5 years. They went all the way through the early part of the school. And I have to say, my youngest now is 3. And the reason we will leave where we are now, the primary reason we'll leave where we are now, is because we want to recreate that experience of early schooling for her. We want to find that somewhere else, because I cannot imagine putting my kids through the early years kind of system in any other way. And for me, that's just really, really important. Like, yeah. And you can see that with the older girl that we have, who's now 9. She's, her creativity's been stifled since she came back here. voice has been stifled. Her confidence has been stifled. She's still the same girl, but she's really struggled to fit into the system which expects her to behave a certain way and be a certain way and learn a certain way. And I think that's a shame. That's a real shame.
Yeah, it is a shame, and I can't agree with you more. And I just had my daughter's 6, and I went to her parent-teacher interview yesterday, and she's just started kindergarten because she'd already started a little bit of it at Green School, so she's sort of a little bit older for her group. And her teacher said, and her teacher's lovely, amazing teacher, and she's just working in the system that our public government system here, that with all their requirements. And one of the questions she asked me was, what are your academic goals for your daughter?
Right.
And I said, and I just looked at her, I just went, for her to have and I just went, fuck this. I didn't say that. I was like, for her to have as much fun as possible. That's what my academic goals are. She's 6, and I wanted to be creative. She's like, aren't you concerned about her learning how to read and write? I'm like, definitely. I mean, I want her to, that'll come, but I don't have academic goals for her. And
for a 6-year-old, right?
And the school system here was she's already undergone testing, testing, ability testing, IQ testing, literacy and numeracy testing. I'm like, I don't want my kids tested straight away. I want them to be having fun and nurturing as much creativity and discovering who they are. But
completely agree with that.
Yeah, and it is the system, but it's just interesting to hear your perspective on it as well.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. My 3-year-old started nursery. She goes 3 days a week. And the first day, they handed me a whole pack of documents. I said, what's this? And they said, it's the curriculum. I was like, right. So, and they're like, well, what are your goals for your, what are the things that she needs to work on? So she doesn't need to work on anything. She's 3. What do you want her to improve at? I was like, well, it'd be great if she becomes out of nursery being a really kind person that likes learning. That's, you don't have to ask that of a 3-year-old, right? But the fact that we're even asking these questions of kids at this age, or to be honest, almost at any age, is indicative of the problem with the system.
Thank you. Yeah, it is indicative of the problem, and I think it's just this process of valuing education and highlighting that we need. It's good to be curious. It's good to ask questions, and we want to learn. And I think it's innate in a child to want to learn, and they're going to learn. I just think you just provide the platform and let them discover it themselves, and just gently guide them.
So I was listening.
It's so complex, but.
So I was listening to. I've been kind of getting into quite a lot of podcasts recently while I've been driving around the Scottish Highlands, and I've listened to quite a few interesting podcasts by Nobel Prize winning folk. So like Nobel Prize winning economists, Nobel Prize winning Peace Prize, various different things. And I had a particular week where I listened to 4 or 5 podcasts of these, really eminent thinkers, sociologists, economists, bankers, financiers, and every single person, and the point of the podcast was not this, but every single person said, when asked the question, what do you fundamentally believe needs to change in our generation to have the most impact on future generations? And everybody said education. Like the way in which the education system is designed and delivered is driving us apart from nature. It's leading us to damage our environment. It's leading children and young adults to have mental health problems, where you feel you don't fit in, you're not the same, you can't learn, you aren't being recognized for your own unique talents. And it's fundamentally hurting the society that we want to build. And I was just really struck by this. And I came home and I was talking to my wife and I was like, if you've got the smartest economist and the smartest banker and the smartest sociologist all saying this thing, why are we doing this to ourselves? We need to come up with a better system. And I actually think, going back to my work a little bit, the environmental challenges we face as society are so deeply rooted in the way in which we educate our children, that that's such a fundamental place that we need to start, and we need to start now because it's generational. Like if we start now, we got to get going on this problem. And this, you've worked in this system, right?
I love that you've said that. I love that you said that. Well, I think what confuses me is that people aren't. I just don't think people are questioning it enough. You know, they're just going like a lot of our parents really questioning it. Like, so like you were given, you know, those documents, and I was asked this question yesterday, you know, by this teacher, and I mean, I'm in the system myself, so I'm not. I don't want to sound like a hypocrite, but I really do. I do feel like that we become a little bit complacent and just conform too easily to this. And like, why aren't we questioning it? And some people are, but I don't think enough are. And like you said at the very start, you get enough people, you get a collective consciousness, you know, all questioning these structures that are just that we've just had for years and years. And once we start questioning these things, I think that's when the change will happen. But yeah, I find it very interesting. I've noticed, sorry, I'm going on a rant here, but even with COVID stuff, I find people have just really conformed to the restrictions that have been placed on them. And I do understand that too. I don't want to denounce that, but it's like people in Australia have just gone, okay, well, I'll do what I'm told. And it's like, well, let's maybe ask a few more questions before we do that. Yeah.
Anyway. Yeah, it's a fascinating bit of work, and it's really interesting having your own kids, right? They become your own mirrors to your own ethics and values, and you have to kind of really analyze what you're like, wow, actually, I do need to make these decisions. These aren't decisions which I can just hand off to somebody else. I actually need to be an active, engaged human in this. Otherwise, these things do happen. You know. Anyway, yeah, it's interesting.
Active, engaged human. Like, would you describe yourself? How do you feel about being described as an activist? Would you say you're an activist?
I think it's a sliding scale. I'm certainly a lot more. I mean, I probably wouldn't describe myself as an activist when standing next to somebody who works for Greenpeace and is carrying a placard down the streets and campaigning like save the whales.
Yeah.
Am I an activist in the sense that I will happily go into a bank or an investment fund or a pension fund and rip them to pieces on their environmental policy? For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Would I chain myself to a tree to stop some like rural community being bulldozed? Absolutely. No questions asked, you know, but I don't know if I'd paint myself with the activist picture necessarily, but yeah, I'll take it. I'll take the label.
You're a badass. You're a badass. I can tell you're a badass, man. You played it down. But listen, it's been epic. Like, it's been well over an hour, and it's getting late in your part of the world. And I'm just really grateful for your time, Matt, and your perspectives on things and your journey so far. So I ask all guests to come to the podcast with a cause that they want to support or advocate for. So have you had to think about that, or would you like to just advocate for the WCS?
No, I'm definitely not going to do that. They're big enough to look after themselves. I think, I think, you know, I was thinking about this. I reckon, you know, for one of the questions I get asked a lot is, what can I do? You know, what do I do about this situation, right? And I think one of the things that you need to do, if you really care about this, if you've got any money at all, go and ask questions of the bank where you put your money. Go and ask questions of the pension fund what you have your money in. If you have stocks and shares, make sure those are going into the best possible environmental ethics, you know, stocks and shares that you can find. And just start asking questions about where your money goes, because as well as the decisions about the products you buy in the supermarket every day, where you stick your money and who is doing what with your money is fundamentally what's driving some environmental issues around the world far, far away from you. So my ask, you know, my kind of plea to everyone listening is, you know, if you care about this stuff, go and ask questions about where your money is.
Amazing. Awesome. And I love that. So we'll put that in your show notes, and that will follow your episode around on all the platforms, Matt. So it's a really great thing to advocate for, and I agree. I'll be really questioning that. I mean, retirement funds are a big one. Like in Australia, your employer is required to pay directly into your retirement fund. It's called superannuation. And your money, it's your money. Yeah, I mean, you never see it. It comes out of your paycheck for most, and it's like a tax. You don't even know it's gone, but it's sitting somewhere. And I can guarantee most people would not know exactly where that money's sitting, and what it's actually supporting and advocating and doing. So good point, man. I'm so stoked you said that. Legend. Now, I've got a gift for you, Matt, and our friends at Indosol are going to send you a pair of shoes.
Awesome.
made from repurposed motor vehicle tires. I just love the company. The same thing, they're trying to make change in their own way, in a small way. So you'll be getting a pair of those in the mail. I don't know how useful they'll be in Scotland because it's cold there. Any good Scottish person.
I'm looking forward to it.
You just have to wear your sandals with socks, man. That's what you do over there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I can use them to dig the snow out from under the car. It's going to be perfect.
Yeah, so that's great. Yeah, you'll be right. And send us a photo of that if you do that, all right? And yeah, you can actually grab a pair of Indosols at indosol.com and use code THT and support the show. You can find Matt's episode on a variety of different platforms to the one you're listening to it on right now. And if you go to turtlehappytalks.com, you'll be able to find a link to different platforms and whatever platform you do like to listen to this podcast on, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Buzzsprout, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, and there's a bunch of others like Podcast Addict. I don't know. It seems to be on a few different platforms now. Please, subscribe or leave a review. Just helps me to, I guess, grow the show and keep it going because I get to speak to epic humans like Matt. So thanks a lot for listening. So that's it, Matt. Dude.
Awesome. Thanks,
How
man.
you feeling? How you feeling?
That was awesome. Loved it. Yeah, let's do it again. I think we should flip the camera around next time. Flip the mic round. I'll interview you. I want to hear some of your stories next time.
It's funny because I'm approaching episode 100. And I've produced now, well, you'll be episode 98. That's 98 episodes in 98 weeks.
Wow.
Haven't missed a week, and it actually, and I'm actually getting a few private messages of people saying that they want to hear my story. And I'm like, I'm not that interesting. I just found, well, I'm really not. I found myself in an interesting situation where and it actually started at the Green School where I was like, this community is really eclectic.
It's wild. Yeah.
And diverse. And I was like, and I've always loved podcasts. And I was like, I just feel like it's the right time to start a podcast. Like even the other teachers I was working with were, they weren't just teachers. They were activists. They were humanitarians. They were musicians, artists, writers. And then you got the families and the parents that were meeting, like such as yourself. They're conservationists, environmentalists, entrepreneurs. And I was like, yeah. So I just I love that.
Yeah, it's also, I agree that's a great community. Interesting bunch of people. Miss it.
But it was interesting. There's the full spectrum, Matt, because I haven't talked too much about it on the podcast, but now that, I haven't worked there for over a year just under a year. It was so interesting because you had this spectrum of like some ridiculously wealthy people and, actually perpetuating environmental in the industries they work in, perpetuating environmental issues, but this desire to advocate for sustainability.
Right.
Did you see that some paradoxes and
absolutely.
Dare I say hypocrisy there?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, there was a lot of that, I think, sadly. And more and more so as our time there went on. Initially there was quite a different vibe in the school where there was tended to be people who were a bit like us. Didn't have that much money, were kind of trying to figure out how to make their way in the world, had some interesting stuff going on, landed there, loved the vibe, carried on staying, right? And then as it became kind of more and more sort of leaning towards richer and richer families, to put no finer point on it. Yeah, definitely there's hypocrisy. They were, it's hard. It's hard to square the fact that you can fly your family around the world 4 or 5 times a year first class, and you work in investment banking or you run a hedge fund with a school which is kind of deep, or meant to be at least, deeply environmental at its core. And that was a conflict they never quite resolved for me.
Yeah, and there's always going to be that level of politics in everything, and especially when people are trying to make change, and fundamentally that school does advocate for change. It's advocating for a philosophy and a theme, and I guess it's inevitable that, it's you're going to get it anywhere. You can't. Right. It's unavoidable, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, it is. It is. I think it was pretty wild. Interesting community. I think most people had their hearts in the right places. Yeah, I can see why it's setting up versions of it all around the world. That seems like a step forward to me, even if it's, the more kids you have coming out of those kinds of schools, the better, fundamentally, I think.
I think so, man. I think so. All right, man. Well, listen, I'm going to let you go. I'm so stoked to talk to you, Matt. You're a legend. I'm so grateful.
That was fun. Yeah, good to talk to you as well, man. I really appreciate it.
You want to finish on something profound? Say something profound. Go. Finish on something profound.
Wow, jeez. No pressure.
No pressure. Time's up. Not profound enough.
No profound. I'm done. It's late. I'm going to bed.